Hey there everyone, welcome back to Utility Sports. Really excited to continue our trade guide series here on the channel leading up to the February 6th NBA trade deadline. Reminder, I will be live on the channel the entire week of the NBA trade deadline, so make sure to leave a like on today's video, subscribe so you don't miss out on future uploads and live streams, hit that notification bell as well. And in today's video, we're going to be covering the New Orleans Pelicans, which was heavily requested over on Twitter. Links in the description if you want to go give me a follow over there. Also, take 1 second right now, comment down below which team would you like to see next in the trade guide series. I read every single comment on the channel, and I want your guys' feedback on who you want to see next in this trade guide series. Let's move forward now into our actual video preview here. We're going to first look at the draft pick situation of the New Orleans Pelicans. It will give us a very good understanding of which assets the Pelicans have to work with after making a couple of splashy trades over the last half decade or so. Of course, the DeJounte Murray was the most recent example of this. We're also going to look at the luxury tax and apron status for this team. This is something that is extremely important and will guide and direct some of their decisions this February. We're also going to look at some of the Pelicans trade likely players. Which players, especially with big contracts, will the Pelicans be looking to move? There will be some important omissions in that section, especially including some of the young guys. So stay tuned for that in this video. Then we'll also dive into some realistic trade partners, teams that I could see the Pelicans discussing big trade frameworks with. And who are some targets maybe that the Pelicans could be looking to get back in return from those trade partners? We'll talk about that as this video progresses. And then ultimately, we'll conclude with the projected activity level for the Pelicans. Their tax and apron status will play a big role in how active they are this trade deadline and the type of trades that they look to make. So keep that in mind as well as we move forward and progress throughout this video. Again, I really hope you guys do enjoy. So let's jump into it with those future draft picks and a little timeline here. The Pelicans did have multiple firsts in the 2025 draft, however, traded out future picks in return for DeJounte Murray. So now they are left at a spot where they only have their own first round pick. Now, if you're curious who the New Orleans Pelicans could look to draft in this year's 2025 class, I do have a mock draft up on the channel rather recently. The Pelicans held the second overall pick in that mock draft. Given how bad their season has gone so far, they have a very solid likelihood to be picking in the top 3 or 4 picks in this year's class, and it's a very good class to do so. So that pick is extremely valuable, not only for the present, but also for the future foundation of the New Orleans Pelicans. Then we have a swap option as well in 2026 with the Milwaukee Bucks. Given how this season has gone for both of these teams, New Orleans is likely to not exercise that swap option, but again, by next season, things could look dramatically differently. Whether a Giannis Antetokounmpo trade request actually comes to fruition or not, who knows about Damian Lillard's long-term future there. The Bucks are an extremely old roster with Chris Middleton, Brook Lopez well into their 30s, Damian Lillard well into his 30s. Giannis Antetokounmpo as well is no longer a young spry chicken himself. So just looking at the current iteration of the Bucks, that pick, who knows? There's, the future's up in the air in Milwaukee, I would say. And for New Orleans specifically, it's likely that maybe they're not a good team again next season. So perhaps holding a lottery pick is very much likely for the Pelicans next year in the 2026 draft. In 2027, they have the option again for a swap, the more favorable of the Bucks or Pelicans pick. The reason that this is the case is they had the Bucks pick outright, then they made a couple of moves involving a third team, which gave them a swap option. They would have originally had both of those picks, but now they just get to keep the more favorable of the two. And then from 2028 through 2031, they have access to all of their own first round picks. So the Pelicans, I would say, all in all, are in a pretty good position here, even after making a big trade for DeJounte Murray, one that was met with some criticism. They still have control of their own future, including access to swap options, and they're in control of their own destiny essentially as a team with draft assets to move or to utilize in the draft itself. We'll see what David Griffin elects to do, if he is even the lead decision maker there in New Orleans past the season. That I think is going to be a big question as well. But going into their luxury tax and apron statuses, this is an extremely important topic, and you might be wondering, why is Kyra Lewis Jr. on the graphic here? Well, if you remember back to last season in my trade deadline predictions video, I said the Pelicans will trade Kira Lewis Jr. They had his $5+ million salary. They were about $4 million over the luxury tax last year. They salary dumped him in a 3-team trade where Pascal Siakam went to Indiana. Kira Lewis Jr. got dealt in that deal. And as a result, the Pelicans ducked below the luxury tax last season. In fact, the day I posted that video is when that actual trade happened, which was funny. With the same thing in mind here, the Pelicans find themselves just narrowly over the tax once again. $2.1 million over the luxury tax. And with New Orleans ownership, obviously the family that is in control of the New Orleans Pelicans, they have a long-standing history of not spending the tax. They do not want to be over the tax. They would rather receive the tax benefits by being under the tax than rather pay into the league by being over the tax. So with that in mind, any big New Orleans Pelicans trade you're making, any kind of mock trades you're seeing, it's more than likely that the Pelicans will look to dump salary rather than take it in, which means if there's a Brandon Ingram trade or a Zion Williamson trade or a CJ McCollum trade on the horizon, it's very, very likely that they look to reduce their salary rather than increase it. They are a little bit under $4 million away from the first apron. Like I just said, I expect this team to dip under the luxury tax. I would be shocked if they approached the first apron at all this trade deadline. Obviously, it would have to be great value for them to do something like that. And I just really don't see that coming to fruition for a team that right now probably has priorities on tanking, losing games for the remainder of the season, trying to set themselves up best for the long-term future of the New Orleans Pelicans. And I think making either a win-now trade just doesn't really help them with their long-term plan anyway. And then also from the historic viewpoint of how this team has gone about spending and avoiding the luxury tax, it's just not very likely to see this team in the first apron. So who are some of their trade likely players? Now you're going to notice that DeJounte Murray is omitted from this graphic. You're going to notice that a lot of the young guys, whether that be Jordan Hawkins or Yves Missi, who's had a fun rookie season for the Pelicans, or Trey Murphy III, who had an explosion just the other night for 32 points, those guys are not on here, nor is Herb Jones. We'll talk about Herb Jones in just a minute, but Brandon Ingram, CJ McCollum, and Zion Williamson, the Pelicans' quote-unquote big three, are the players to watch for in a potential Pelicans trade, a franchise-changing trade this trade deadline. They currently have 14 players on standard NBA contracts, so if they were to duck below the tax, they can't just do so by dumping a minimum level player because the NBA would require them to have 14 players on roster. So with that in mind, if the Pelicans are going to dip below the tax like I assume, a trade with one of their players making $4 to $36 million will have to be likely involved in a deal. So that could be someone as cheap as Jordan Hawkins, which again, I don't think he'll get traded. I would be pretty surprised if New Orleans did trade him after taking him in the lottery just a couple of drafts ago. So we turn our eyes to the veteran, more established players. CJ McCollum, a player, got 2 years left on his deal, $64 million. That, of course, includes this season as well. It's a descending contract, making over $33 million this year, and then under $31 million next year. So if you look at that perspective, trading CJ McCollum this year, yes, it could help them financially, especially with dipping under the tax, which I've talked about multiple times already, but also next year becoming an expiring contract at $30 million could be a very good trade chip for them if they did hold on to CJ McCollum this year. Brandon Ingram, he's in the final year of his deal, so this could be a fun rental player for a team looking to contend. He could also be maybe a player who other teams that are in the lottery could view as a real cornerstone addition to their franchise. Of course, a former All-Star. Now, over the last few years, he has struggled with injuries, efficiency in some ways, and of course, his play style with the way the modern NBA works isn't the most electric or most efficient way to play the game. He settles for a lot of pull-up jump shots, doesn't take a super high volume of threes, even though he is a very offensively talented player. I think the questions about his long-term contract and the questions about his play style specifically around other star talent might hamper his trade value quite a bit, especially in the final year of his deal. So would the Pelicans settle for a smaller package centered around Brandon Ingram, I think the likelihood of that is very possible, especially with Trey Murphy's extension about to kick in next year after signing a rookie extension this past offseason. And then Zion Williamson, a 4-year, $166 million guaranteed to him. And now remember, yes, there are some things included in that contract which does protect New Orleans financially. There are non-guarantees across the board for a variety of different reasons, including weight and so on and so forth. But Zion still, you go back to the 2019 NBA draft, they took him first overall over Ja Morant. He was the player that a lot of people were labeling as generational. Now, I myself was a little bit lower on Zion than the remainder of the draft community. I had him number 2 in that class behind Ja Morant because I did have serious concerns about the weight, the explosiveness, just his play style in general, and the longevity that I thought that was going to be able to provide. Now, of course, there have been several other off-the-court factors that have factored in as well, unfortunately, including being late for team practices and team flights. And then, of course, some other off-the-court stuff with certain celebrities I'm not going to get too into here. But Zion Williamson is such a fascinating player because I'm going to talk about several teams who will be interested in potentially acquiring him if the Pelicans are either making or willing to take calls on his name. But again, the dilemma here is you just took him first overall a half decade ago. So if you trade him, you're basically giving up on that. And they traded Anthony Davis with the mindset that Zion Williamson was going to be the next franchise superstar. And while he is a 2-time All-Star, it just hasn't really come to fruition in the way that I think a lot of people at the time expected Zion Williamson to be this 1A superstar who would lift the Pelicans not only to the playoffs consistently, but to playoff series wins, something that they have yet to do after drafting Zion Williamson in the 2019 NBA draft. So, who are some of those potential trade partners? There's a long list here of players, of teams that I would be interested in some of these top-end players from the Pelicans. The Portland Trailblazers stand out to me as a team that could look at either one of Brandon Ingram or Zion Williamson. Brandon Ingram is still surprisingly young. It feels like he's been in the NBA for so long, but he's in his mid to late 20s right now. So you're looking at 4 or 5 more good years of NBA basketball ahead of him, which would align pretty well with his next contract. Now, of course, there is, again, stipulations that will make trading for him difficult given the fact he's in the final year of his deal. The Pelicans really don't have a lot of leverage because of that, because they don't have team control. And then also, depending on how much money Brandon Ingram is expecting to make on his next contract, that will also potentially hamper his trade value. But Portland could be a team, I think, looking for another wing. They went out and traded for Denny Avdija last offseason. And for New Orleans, first of all, they were a team that was heavily interested in Scoot Henderson. There were reports that they had tried to trade up to pick number 2 with the Charlotte Hornets back in the 2023 NBA draft in order to draft Scoot Henderson. Of course, that did not actually occur, but if the Blazers were willing to talk shop, Scoot Henderson, who just had a career night the other night, scoring 39 points and making 8 3-pointers, maybe the Pelicans and Blazers could work something out for former top overall picks, whether that be Zion Williamson in exchange for Scoot Henderson and some other stuff. The Blazers do have a variety of different salaries, including Jeremy Grant. They have DeAndre Ayton, a few names in there that they could throw around. They also have some draft pick equity that they could use in a deal if one were to come to fruition. The Utah Jazz, another team here where Danny Ainge, behind his master plot and master scheme of improving his roster year over year, it usually comes down to finding talent at a bargain. He shops the bargain bin better than pretty much anyone else in the NBA. He got John Collins a few years ago for a measly second-round pick. Got Lauri Markkanen and multiple first-round picks and swaps in the trade for Donovan Mitchell. Of course, the Cavs, I think, are pretty happy with the results of that as well, though. He also got multiple first and young players for Rudy Gobert. So even though Utah hasn't been able to cash in at the very top of the draft yet, after making all of those moves, I think the Jazz are relatively happy with the overall collection of assets that they've received in those trades. And they could maybe look to try and buy low again on some talent, whether that be Brandon Ingram, former number 2 overall pick many drafts ago, or Zion Williamson, who we've already talked at length about in this video. I could see the Jazz expressing interest in either one of them. I don't think CJ McCollum fits the timeline at all there in Utah. But Zion Williamson alongside Lauri Markkanen and Walker Kessler is a pretty unique front court. given the shooting of Markkanen, the rim protection of Kessler, and then, of course, the downhill force, which is Zion Williamson, still when he's healthy, one of the better offensive players in the NBA. It would be an interesting combination. Of course, Brandon Ingram could help with the kind of absence of scoring wings there in Utah. Now, again, if you're looking at how the modern game is played, this doesn't help the Jazz's three-point volume as much. But Ingram, of course, could be a primary initiator, shot creator for them offensively. The Miami Heat, even though I don't think the Heat are going to have a lot of interest in keeping these players long term, I could see the Miami Heat being a team that would be willing to eat a contract in a 3-team deal that would send Jimmy Butler to destination X, Y, or Z. The player most specifically that I think would make sense for Miami here is Brandon Ingram, because he has an expiring contract. Now, Zion Williamson, obviously one of his biggest problems since coming into the NBA has been the weight discussion and the way that Heat culture plays out and the importance of being fit and in shape. Maybe Miami would be the perfect landing spot for Zion Williamson. Now, again, I'm not projecting or predicting that the Heat will actually go after Zion aggressively in any type of deal. Again, I think Ingram is the more likely option given the short duration of his contract, and Miami may be prioritizing flexibility more than anything. We'll see how this all plays out, but I did want to mention the Heat as a potential Brandon Ingram landing spot. The Brooklyn Nets, another team that has been kind of rumored to be looking to make some noise. They have been linked multiple times to Giannis Antetokounmpo, and if they do want Giannis Antetokounmpo, maybe trying to surround him with other talent that they could acquire on the down low for cheap this trade deadline, if that's Brandon Ingram or maybe a little bit more spendy in Zion Williamson, that could be an interesting way for Brooklyn to go. And you listen to some of the recent comments from Zion Williamson about NBA arenas that he really loves playing in. He had some interesting notes in there, and he specifically mentioned the Brooklyn Nets arena, which is pretty interesting because for the most part, I haven't heard a lot of people hyping up the Barclays Center too much. Not that it's a bad arena at all, but he mentioned the Brooklyn Nets by name, which was interesting, I would say, and something to monitor moving forward. The Sacramento Kings could be a very intriguing team for Zion Williamson. One of the things the Kings really do not have is athleticism. Now, of course, the Kings have been linked multiple times in the past to Brandon Ingram, but after acquiring DeMar DeRozan this past offseason, I think there's too much overlap between Ingram and DeRozan's play style, so I think Ingram is probably out of the running for the Sacramento Kings. Williamson, of course, a bit of a more spendy option, so Sacramento would have to be willing to part with a couple of first-round picks and some other salary in a deal. But I think Zion would be a very intriguing get for Sacramento if they're looking to try and appeal to De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis long-term about adding more offensive talent and firepower. Zion Williamson, when he is healthy and on the court, like I said earlier, he's one of the best offensive players given his rim volume, rim pressure, the ability to beat guys off the dribble, get to the offensive glass as well, and put back his own misses. He's just an impressive offensive player. Of course, does go left a ton. He's very reliant on his left hand. But overall, I think Zion in Sacramento would be a really, really fun landing spot. Could you imagine him taking a DHO from Domantas Sabonis? That kind of just sounds scary for anyone sitting around the rim. It's like a bull in a china shop, honestly, in a good way. The Denver Nuggets could be a low-key sleeper team for Brandon Ingram, centered something around Michael Porter Jr.'s contract. Now, Denver, if I was running the Denver Nuggets, I'd be prioritizing more three-point shooting. Trading Michael Porter Jr. for Brandon Ingram would do the exact opposite, so you might say, well, why would they look at that? If you look at the Denver Nuggets and their recent moves, there's been nothing in the last 3 or 4 years that have really shown them as a team that prioritizes three-point volume. Jamal Murray's a heavy mid-range pull-up jump shooter. Of course, Jokic is a very tremendously offensively talented player. He's shooting the three ball really well this year, but for his career, it's not like he's a super high-volume, high-efficiency three-point shooter either. Aaron Gordon's not a great three-point shooter. Russell Westbrook's not a great three-point shooter. Christian Brown, before this season, was not a super reliable three-point shooter either. So Denver, even though they are a very good team, they're not overly reliant on three-pointers. So a swap of MPJ for Ingram, even though, in my opinion, that's not a smart move for Denver, it could be something that Calvin Booth and the Nuggets actually maybe explore a little bit and check on the value there. And then Detroit as well, I think could be an interesting landing spot for any of these three players. For me, I think the market for CJ McCollum is quite a bit smaller. I don't see a ton of teams that would be very interested in going after him given his age, contract status. And even though he has had some awesome performances as of late, his impact on winning this year hasn't been elite either. So McCollum, I think with the Jay Ivey injury, could fill a pretty good need for the Pistons if they're looking to actually make a playoff push and get playoff experience for some of their young players. And the duration of McCollum's contract is not long-term hampering for them at all. The same is true here for Brandon Ingram. Again, final year of his deal. The Pistons could either look at it as a rental of offensive talent around Cade Cunningham or maybe a build-around infrastructural piece as well. They have a lot of young players to offer. I'm sure New Orleans would be very interested to talk trade with them. Maybe something centered around Jaden Ivey, who, like I have mentioned, is injured at the moment. It would be an interesting discussion nonetheless. And then Zion Williamson, again, probably not super likely, but I think they're in Detroit, even though defensively, I think the Pistons do need more defensive help in their front court, specifically around anchoring Jalen Duren a bit. Zion Williamson doesn't offer that, but he has decent activity on defense from time to time, gets in the passing lanes a little bit. He's a defensive disruptor more than he is any form of a stopper. And that comes and goes, right? It's not consistent. Zion Williamson is not a consistently active defensive player by any stretch. But when he is engaged and active on the defensive end, his athleticism does still really pop from time to time. And then, of course, again, it's an offensive talent upgrade for Detroit into their front court along their other talented players who have really broken out and emerged this year in a big way. When it comes to Herb Jones, I promised we would talk about him in this video. There's a reason I have pretty much every single logo of every single NBA team on the graphic here when it comes to Herb Jones trade destinations. Every single team in the league would want Herb Jones, would have significant interest in landing Herb Jones, whether it be contenders like the Memphis Grizzlies or the Dallas Mavericks or the Denver Nuggets. They would all have interest. And if it's a rebuilding team like the Portland Trailblazers or Washington Wizards, they would also have interest. Herb Jones is on one of the most team-friendly contracts in the entire association. He is an all-defensive menace, one of the best perimeter defenders, if not the best perimeter defender in all of basketball. He's extremely switchy, versatile. You can use him in a variety of ways defensively. I think his defensive versatility really pops off the charts as a guy who you can ask to be your nail help player. He can be a defensive disruptor off the ball, playing in the passing lanes, playing as the low man, weak side help guy. But he also is just tremendous on the ball. His screen navigation is very good, of course, very long, athletic. And then offensively, too, I think if you go back to even some of his Alabama days, the playmaking was something that was undersold for him as a prospect. I was one of the few people who even had a real first-round grade on him back in his draft. And honestly, I was still way too low on him. I didn't give enough credit where it was due with his overall talent. And he's one of the most intriguing players who could potentially become available this trade deadline. So for the Pelicans, if you're a Pelicans fan, first of all, you're probably saying, well, if every team wants him, why would we trade him? You might not. And that's why I didn't talk about him as one of those trade likely players. But he might be in a situation here where the Pelicans could be overwhelmed by an offer, where a team is willing to give up maybe 2 or even 3 first-round picks, plus a young player, plus other assets, whether that be second-round draft compensation or expiring salary. There's a lot of possibilities here where New Orleans could get very, 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 very strong offers in a trade market that seems like it's going to be pretty limited this trade deadline because of the new second apron rules and the trade restrictions that are applied because of that. Herb Jones might be the crown jewel of the trade deadline, even over a guy like Jimmy Butler, just given how good of a player Herb Jones is. He should be the top trade candidate in the NBA because of how well he fits into a team's salary cap positioning and the impact he can have, not just on the defensive end, but as a two-way player, because I think, again, offensively, his talents and skills are very much undersold on a night-to-night basis. I think he's just a really, really good NBA player and someone who, when it comes to winning games as a team, Herb Jones is one of the more valuable players around the league at a dollar amount that is extremely affordable and honestly a very small, underpaid number for a couple of years now for Herb Jones. So every single team in the league will have interest in Herb Jones if he becomes available, and it could be a huge cash cow for the Pelicans if they do trade him and add multiple future first-round picks in a deal centered around Herb Jones. When it comes to projected activity level, I think for New Orleans specifically, we're going to see their activity level ramp up over the next couple of weeks leading up to that February 6th trade deadline. They're going to start to get a little more antsy as time goes on. I think, again, ducking below the tax is very, very important for them. And they're going to be a big facilitator of trades as a third team. That's something maybe I haven't talked about as much as I should have up to this point in the video. When it comes to Jimmy Butler trades, when it comes to other big player names, when it comes to other mid-sized salaries, the Pelicans could be a team that looks to offload money. Specifically, Brandon Ingram, with it being the final year of his deal, I think that makes a ton of sense. Now, what does Brandon Ingram net in a trade? Maybe one first-round pick, or maybe a collection of second-round picks. I think that's kind of the value we're maybe waiting to see for Brandon Ingram. But nonetheless, I think the Pelicans will be active. I think they will be taking calls, but I don't think they're also going to rush into anything. I don't really expect a Zion Williamson trade. A CJ McCollum trade would not shock me, although I just don't know if the market's very large for him. A Brandon Ingram trade feels inevitable at this point in time, given their tax status and everything that is going on around the Pelicans organization right now. I really hope you guys did enjoy today's video. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more, hit that notification bell. Let me know down in the comment section below what you want the Pelicans to do, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.